everyone, and happy Wednesday. That little jingle means it is time for Find My Pass from Home. I admit that I dance to that song in the background when you can't see me every time it plays. So we're happy to be with you on this Wednesday afternoon, morning, midday, wherever it is, wherever you are, whatever time of day it is in your location. We are here today to talk about Beatrix Potter and some of the people in her world. So it's a little bit of a special story to share today. So we're very happy for you to have joined us. My name is Jen Baldwin. I'm the research specialist at Findmypast. Some of you know me. For those of you who are new to Findmypast from Home, welcome. We are very happy that you're here. Please do tell us who you are, where you are, and what you're up to in the comments. This is a community and we want you to be a part of it. And so please be active in that comment thread. Also in the comments today with us is Ellie, the fabulous and wonderful and just joyful person that she is. I love working with Ellie. She's one of my favorite colleagues. Big loves. Yep, let's start with the weather report. As some of you are already chiming in on the comments, Andrea is in a very cold Stoke-on-Trent. Rosaline is in Edinburgh with us. I know it's cold there as well because I was just talking to Ellie about that. Betsy's in South Africa. Hello, and thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know, I am in Colorado. In the United States. It is 29 degrees here Fahrenheit right now. Yeah, it hasn't changed, which is about -1.5 Celsius. So I think I'm about the same as Scotland right now, or the southern portion of Scotland at least. Oh, Nancy's with us from Norway. That's lovely. Thank you for joining us. Rosie's here. Thank you. I know it's not Friday. We're doing a Wednesday session today. I don't get to do Wednesday sessions very often, so I'm pretty happy about this. Victoria's with us in Suffolk and freezing. That is unfortunate. Ellie and I were just talking about the situation in the UK and the energy and the costs and everything. So my heart goes out to all of you. I know you're not used to these kinds of conditions. It's dramatic, right? There's lots of weatherizing things you can do to your house to help. So take a look at those options. That's my home improvement suggestion for the day. Gina's with us from Boston and Lincolnshire. Thank you so much for joining us. Also -1C there today and frosty. Karen is with us in North London. And yes, I'm looking sideways today and my screens are set up differently. It's great to have you guys all with us and to see so many familiar faces. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to go ahead and jump in though, because today's session is a little bit of kind of acknowledging an important anniversary, but also acknowledging a woman and an author who has had an incredible impact and influence on English culture, like English speaking culture, like not just England, but all of us who kind of use English as our primary language. And that, of course, is Beatrix Potter, one of the treasures and gems of England and English history. I had the privilege of doing some research on Beatrix Potter and her life a few months ago. This is in partnership with the National Trust. We kind of celebrated her birthday with the National Trust, but we cultivated a lot of research and a number of different stories that actually weren't able to be told at that time. So Ellie and I thought that December would be the right time. Beatrix Potter died 79 years ago on the 22nd of December, 1943. So we're kind of honoring her life a little bit. And we wanted to share some of these stories and what we have found. So if you're a Beatrix Potter fan, please do let us know in the comments. I will admit that she was actually not a huge part of my childhood, but I've learned a lot about her in the last 6 months. And I've reread many of her stories in that time. And she really did just have an incredible impact in many, many ways that I think a lot of people don't really think about, right? Like a lot of this I definitely did not know. So if you are a true Beatrix Potter, like fan, you may know all of this already. But for me, a lot of this was quite new. And I do have to start by acknowledging and thanking my colleagues at Findmypast for helping with this research. There were a number of people involved in this project. A couple of them were are really avid Beatrix Potter fans, and they were taking books off their personal library shelves and scanning pages and sending them to me for context and information. So this would not have come together without my colleagues at Find My Past. So I'm just going to scroll through the comments every once in a while and making sure I'm not missing anything. So let's go ahead and get started. Right when we started looking at Beatrix Potter and celebrating her birthday, there we go. There's my slides. And actually, I'm going to take myself out of the screen so that these are nice and big so you guys can see everything. Okay, so Beatrix Potter, we looked at a number of different aspects of her life, and of course, we know that there is already a lot out there on her life in particular, right? There are a number of biographies. Her family members have written memoirs. Friends of hers, people who worked for her, have written memoirs. There's a lot of documentation. She wrote a lot of letters. Much of that is available through archives or even online. So we wanted to look at her life and her environment and her community in a little bit of a different way. So obviously, the 1921 census of England and Wales plays a big part in this research because that was kind of the new piece of information, right? That was the new historical record that had just been made available to us and gave us the opportunity to look at Beatrix Potter in a slightly different way. So we took a number of different angles, and I'm going to share just little snippets of each of those, but then I'm going to give you a little bit of a case study as well on one of the women in particular that was in her community that Beatrix Potter certainly had an influence over. Um, so let's talk about those women. Oh my gosh, the slides click. There we go. Okay. So we know Beatrix Potter was supportive of women in many different ways. Now, the literature and the biographies will tell us that she wasn't at all like a feminist in the kind of classic sense of the word. But what we found was that there was these little tendencies that she had to kind of support women in very different ways. She had a very traditional relationship with her husband, right? He was head of household. Um, and that was where she was comfortable, and that is very clear through her letters and the documents we have of her lifetime. um, but she did all of these little things that kind of wiggled their way into what we might think of as kind of miniature acts of feminism today. And those were the things that I found to be particularly delightful, right? So there's a number of women in her life that she supported. Um, this actually started before World War One, when there was right on the edge of World War One, and there was an article in a newspaper. I think it was the Times. It said something, and it was an argument basically against encouraging women to take on roles in agriculture as the war started to pick up and men joined the forces. Um, and Beatrix Potter wrote a letter back in response to that, basically saying, you know, this is nonsense. Women can absolutely contribute to the world of farming. And in that letter, she put out a call and then followed it up with an ad in the papers for a female employee that she was seeking. She ended up hiring a woman by the name of Eleanor Choice, who then turned into a lifelong friend. So there are a number of archives that hold letters between Beatrix Potter and Eleanor Choice, and it's very revealing, right? Reading some of those letters. But Eleanor becomes this lifelong friend after she spends a few years working on the farm. We also see Beatrix Potter doing these kind of little acts like allowing Girl Guides to camp on her property. Also, kind of a well known story about Beatrix Potter, but the Girl Guides having tea with her and presenting plays to her for her birthday where they took on the characters in her books. So there's all of these different ways in which she kind of incorporated herself and kind of had an influence in her community by doing just kind of these little acts. And it's these little everyday things that was really intriguing to me. So I want to start with Eleanor Choice because she did become that lifelong friend. And I'm just going to mention that probably the biggest surprise on studying Beatrix Potter and her community in the 1921 census is that I really thought by reading up that Eleanor Choice would be employed elsewhere during the census, and somewhere else in the country. Turns out she's actually staying at Hilltop and she is visiting her now friend, previous employer, Beatrix Potter. So we actually see her at the Hilltop property, which of course was one of Beatrix's properties. Um, so That was just almost an immediate delight when we started this project of just saying, like, where is Eleanor Choice, this woman who had such an influence on Beatrix Potter, and they had this very special relationship. And turns out she's at Hilltop, right? Of course, Beatrix wasn't alone in this push to encourage women into agriculture. There are a number of articles in the paper, and there are other resources that tell us that employing women was kind of this national effort during the war and led to a lot of changes in agriculture across England and kind of a role shift as women started to do a little bit more than just their home garden, but taking on, you know, much larger operations over time. So she was a little bit on the forefront of that movement, of that agricultural change in terms of getting women to be involved in agriculture. Okay, let's see. I'm still going to go back and forth and check comments. Yeah, Victoria is saying, this is a great one, actually. Thank you, Victoria. Incredible lady, and so thankful for what she has left us. She has a wonderful legacy. I absolutely agree. Um, really good. I know a lot of you are probably going to say things about visiting her property, and I think that's one of the special things about what she did, and we'll get to this actually before I'm done today. Her her legacy is so much more than just her books and her stories. Her legacy is part of that National Trust property and what she did in the Lake District region, but it's also this kind of legacy of just awareness, I guess, is what I have come to internalize as I've gone through this project. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about some of the other women around her. And I mentioned the Girl Guides. This was another really interesting aspect for me. I grew up as a Girl Scout, right? The US version of Girl Guides. So I have all these memories and visions of my own life and thinking about how I spent, camp time, right? Like camping and that kind of thing with my Girl Scout troop. So when I found entries and notices of Girl Guides kind of being around her, I immediately had this kind of connection of like what that would have been like. But certainly their experience would have been different in a way, because it was such an early time for the Girl Guides, right? They were still relatively new in the 1920s. I had the privilege of getting access to a collection of records from one of the local archives in the Lake District and read through the meeting minutes of the local Girl Guides in the area and how they organized themselves and the kind of activities they did. It's really fascinating kind of cultural history. I didn't include it in the slide because it didn't actually ever mention Beatrix Potter, but they certainly talk about their camping and their preparations for camping and the other activities that they were engaged in and the type of fundraising that they did and social etiquette and just all sorts of really interesting ideas and concepts that they threw around at their meetings and trying to say, like, how do we keep our girls interested? Um, Beatrix Potter, of course, was very involved in Girl Guides. I already mentioned that she let the girls camp on her property. There were a couple of mentions in the newspaper specifically saying that they were camping actively at Troutbeck. It doesn't specify if they were camping on Troutbeck Farm, which was at the time one of Beatrix Potter's properties, or just in the region or nearby. But we know that she did allow them to camp on her property. And we also know that several of her family members were involved in the Girl Guides. Her two sisters, Blanche and Marion, were both heavily involved with the Girl Guides all the way through their adult lives. In 1921, they're actually living together, and they lived together for many years. They were together in 1911 and I think 1901 as well. In 1921, they're living with their Uncle George, who is a retired architect. And then three of Beatrix's nieces on the Heelis side of the family were members of the Girl Guides and very active in their local groups. But especially Sylvie Heelis was very, very active for many, many years. So we see kind of this interesting relationship and dynamic, right? One of the things that you read about Beatrix Potter, and I think it comes up quite often actually, is this kind of attitude that the neighborhood kids didn't really see her as like this friendly, loving woman, and she was a little bit of a curmudgeon. Um, but actually, she was there. There's a whole nother side to that story, right? Um, those kids would often kind of climb the fence and steal our apples and those kinds of things. I mean, I did that growing up too. So guilty as charged, but I can understand why that would irritate her a little bit. But at the same time, she also kept bunnies in her kind of kitchen garden, so that when children came to her door, Peter Rabbit was right outside, right? So I think there's a very interesting dynamic mix of who she presented herself to be, and then kind of these other little actions that she took on that kind of show a slightly different side of her and her decisions. So um really, really, I just it's to me, it's always fascinating to dive into one human being in such an in-depth way and look at their relationships and their dynamics around their community and how they dealt with certain situations. So here's this, famous figure, who, for lack of a better term, is experiencing kind of a mini version of what we would today refer to as paparazzi, kind of just showing up randomly on her doorstep, and she's just trying to farm and like live her life, right? And so she has her ways of dealing with that, and in some capacities she's seen as kind of, maybe not the most welcoming person, but at the same time, like, you're interrupting her. She's trying to deal with her sheep or whatever she's doing, and you've just knocked on her door unannounced, right? So yeah, there's a little bit of a balance there. um, and the Herdwick sheep are, it's special, and she recognized that as being special. She really wanted to preserve that, and again, I'll talk about that in a bit as well. Okay, so what's next? So the one person that I really, really was so intrigued with when I started learning about Beatrix Potter was the nurse. So um, most of the literature will tell you that she had a involvement in getting the first district nurse in the region, kind of making that a position, providing housing, kind of making that happen in the area, right? And throughout the literature, I kept thinking, like, who was this nurse? And the 1921 census allows us to firmly identify that individual. So her name was Florence Filkin. Um, I actually did not find a reference that named the first nurse of the Troutbeck region at all. So if someone knows about something out there that exists that actually identifies Florence, I would actually really love to know about that. Um, I poured through several books, and lots of online resources and lots of archives, and I couldn't ever find anybody saying her name. They just referred to her as the first nurse, and I kept going, who. Um, and so the 1921 census tells us that it was in fact Florence. Um, so we know that Beatrix Potter kind of schemed a little bit to get that first nurse for the area. Florence was actually the daughter of Henry Filkin and his wife Elizabeth. Henry was himself in the British Army, and his father was in the British Army. So a very military oriented family. Florence was born in Montreal, Canada, and her sisters were born in Malta, London, Hampshire, and Middlesex. So you can automatically kind of just see that military influence on their life just based on where the children were born, right? Um, she gained her training at the Children's Hospital in the late 1880s. Her full file as a nurse is available through the National Archives, and that's part of what you're looking at on the screen. And then in that file, she lists exactly where she has spent time and for how long. Right, you can see the year range for each hospital there on her document. Um, so she was at the Children's Hospital. She was at Leeds General from 1891 to 96. From 1899, though, starting in 1899 to 1902, she served with the Army Nursing Service Reserve as a sister, and that was her rank in that one of those first initial nursing corps for the military. She saw active duty. That's a more modern term, but she was actively engaged in the Boer Wars. She did travel overseas. And so the picture you're looking at is a group of nursing sisters from the Army Nursing Service Reserve during the Boer Wars. So they're sitting outside their tent and they're in their uniforms. That is what Florence would have looked like and dressed like. We don't actually know the names of these women. The picture is the women are unidentified in the photo, which is a shame. But that is the kind of environment and kind of costuming that Florence would have been wearing at the time. So she served during the Boer Wars, and she came home in the early 1900s. She then took on a role as the county superintendent of nursing in a region of Cheshire. So she is there in the 1911 census. She is kind of just living her life as a nurse, right? She's single. She's unmarried. She never has any children. She's called to active duty again in 1914 at the outbreak of World War I. And you get a sense of her personality a bit in her military records because she gets called up, and she ends up going overseas. Within just a couple of months, she is writing letters home to her family in the Sunderland area, and saying, these soldiers really need some help. And she's kind of sending these appeals and saying, hey, family, will you please print this, have the local paper print this letter? It actually did get printed in the Times as well. And she's asking for people to send gifts of tobacco and other products to the wounded in France. So you kind of get the sense that Florence is one of these women who just dives into what she's doing just wholeheartedly. And you see that a bit throughout her military experience. The newspapers covered her career pretty heavily, which made some of the research a lot more interesting because you kind of get a different couple of different perspectives. So during the war, she serves with the military nurses as part of Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, which is a mouthful, and I'm probably not going to say that again. Um, it was a pretty prestigious group of nurses, and of course, incredibly important to the war effort, as we all know. So during the war, she serves in France. She also serves locally. So at one point, she's stationed at the Aldershot Military Hospital. This is the first base hospital in England to receive casualties directly from the Western Front. They received the wounded men after the Battle of Mons on August 20th, 1914. This is also the hospital that is considered to be the birthplace of plastic surgery in the British Empire. And her military record is on the screen. I know it's hard to read, but her name is circled in there. Um, this hospital actually became incredibly important, right? So if you think about plastic surgery in World War One, that just kind of the beginnings of that type of medical treatment, you're talking about men who are missing limbs, and are incredibly tragically wounded. But most of the plastic surgery efforts were centered around the face. Many of us would have seen pictures of these men after the fact. If you haven't, do look for that. Although I'll give you a bit of a trigger warning on these. The plastic surgery in its infancy was not the craft and skill that we know today. So she would have seen all of this happening. She would have experienced the tragedy of the reality of the war day to day. She was given a mention in dispatches on the 26th of February 1915. The then commander in chief of the Expeditionary Force in France, Sir John French, mentioned her. She was acknowledged for gallant and distinguished service in the field. Again, kind of pointing to her personality a bit and really acknowledging that she was that woman that would just go in full force. It had to have been an incredibly powerful time to have been a nurse, right? I guess we could probably say that about just about any kind of conflict like that, but World War One was difficult by any stretch of the imagination. So you're experiencing soldiers who were shell shocked, as the term was used then. Certainly, we would probably refer to many of those cases as PTSD. And then the physical changes as well would have been just an incredible thing to try and handle. Right. So that is kind of um, my kind of thoughts on, I guess, her service during the war. It would have been, I think, life changing. So after the war, she comes back. She resigns from her role in Cheshire County officially in 1917. She takes a couple of years off. She's actually in the north east side of the country with her family during that time. Sorry, a little sip of water there. She then takes the appointment in Hawkshead. She was hired in December of 1919. And the change in her career, her appointment there was documented on the 10th of January, 1920, in the Nursing Record or the British Journal of Nursing, same publication, two different titles. So her appointment was noted in the kind of documentation of the nursing world. And actually, just about every change that she made was noted in one of those publications. And we see her there that Miss Florence Filkin has moved to Hawkshead to take on that appointment. So that is where we find her in the 1921 census. As district nurse, she was paid £75 annually, plus room and board, weekly laundry, and an £8 uniform allowance. When she first arrived, she was furnished with 2 furnished rooms with fire, light, and attendance. And then later, Beatrix Potter actually basically donates a cottage. So she moves into a fully furnished cottage that belonged to Beatrix Potter. She retires in 1924. She has a very long and honorable career. She dies just a few years later. Again, kind of in the northwest, northeast region with her family. Uh, she is replaced. Another nurse is, takes on the duties. She was well respected in the community of Hawkshead. She was known to be stern and very business oriented, but she was incredibly instrumental in kind of establishing that original kind of reputation and prestige of a district nurse in the region. So this is her 1921 census return. um, you can see that she's, it's pretty straightforward. She's living simply by herself. As I said, she never did marry or have any children, but in her signature line, she does say Florence E. Filkin, right, district nurse. I mean, she says it a couple of times on the form, and I find that to be quite also revealing in terms of her personality. In that, she is appropriately proud, I think, of her position, and definitely wants to make sure that she is documented as such. And I found that to be quite interesting. So there you go, the story of the Lake District's, or the Hawkshead region's first nurse, brought to you by Beatrix Potter, and the 1921 census. Right, she has a fascinating life, and her family does as well. I think it's a story that definitely deserves to be told. Now, Beatrix Potter also, of course, memorialized people in different ways, and she engaged with her relationships in ways that we may not see right away. It's not as obvious sometimes when the relationship is documented, but I think that it's worth noting that she left dedications in her books. And I was curious about some of those individuals, right? Who are the people that she dedicated her books to, and why were they important to her? So, a couple of those people, just to mention, Eleanor Warren. Actually, Eleanor Margaret Warren was in the dedication of The Tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse. She was the daughter of Beatrix Potter's publisher, Harold Warren. She was known as Nellie, but her full name was Eleanor. She was born in Hampstead in 1901. So in the 1921 census, she is a 19-year-old young woman, and she's actually listed herself. I love it. In the census, it says daughter, and then head is written over the top, because her father and her sister are on holiday in Kent. So she is home alone with a couple of visitors. Um, and she's basically saying, like, they left me in charge of the house, right? She's 19 years old, and I get to be in charge of the home while we have someone kind of here with us visiting. So I love Eleanor's little Nellie's little bit of independence when she crosses off daughter and actually writes in head of household. Another one to mention is Lucy Carr. She inspired the character of Lucy in The Tale of Mrs. Tiggywinkle. She was the daughter of the local vicar, Benjamin Lund Carr, who was in the region and around Beatrix Potter when several years prior, right? By 1921, the family had actually moved on. They're at the Waterstock Rectory in Oxfordshire. The rectory itself is now a grade 2 listed building. Benjamin, Lucy's father, dies in 1922. So Alice, her mom, Benjamin's wife, and her daughters, including Lucy, move into a large Victorian property, Staverton Grange in North Oxford. Lucy later actually gets involved with the Society of Overseas Settlement of British Women and travels to South Africa as a governess. And she goes back and forth between South Africa and England a couple of times. That Society for Overseas Settlement of British Women is another very interesting story from that interwar period, where they're looking at, the government is basically saying we have less men than we have women. We know that from the 1921 census. And so who are all these women going to marry? So they actually took single women and kind of made it a migration scheme and shipped them off to different areas across the Commonwealth. It was both popular and very unpopular, depending on who you asked at the time. But an interesting initiative and project. So it was quite interesting for me to find that Lucy, kind of daughter of a vicar, was involved in that organization. And she, again, never married, never had any children of her own or a family. She was involved in kind of women's activities, women's organizations most of her life. Okay, so the dedications continue. There's a few that I didn't get into in as much detail, but there's some. Um, One more that I wanted to mention, and that is William Francis. The full dedication was William Francis of Ulva someday with an exclamation point inscribed into the tail of Mr. Todd. William Francis Clark was the son of the Lord of Ulva, and actually, really interesting story there. Captain Francis Clark, actually, from the Sutherland Highlanders. He did serve time in the war, but the Ulva property, right? The Lord of Ulva was a title that actually is quite unique in and of itself, that it was passed down only by inheritance for 900 years, right? So that's an incredible chain. So they never had a moment of conquest or sale. It was just passed from their lineage, their family lineage, for 900 years, which is a pretty incredible moment. I didn't dig into his life as much as I wanted to, but it's still kind of on that list of things to do, right? And so these inscriptions, these dedications, I think, are a really great way for us to examine these relationships of Beatrix Potter as well. And then, of course, we have the farm itself, right? So Mrs. Heelis, as she was, of course, referred to appropriately instead of calling her Beatrix Potter, right? Her name was formally Mrs. Heelis, employed at least 5 people in 1921. And I found it interesting that they range so much in age. Um, so the youngest employee was 20 years old, and her oldest at the time was 68. There's a couple of names in here that, if you are familiar with Beatrix Potter's life, you're going to kind of, oh yeah, I recognize that. But there were some that were quite new to us as well. So living at Hilltop, the property, the house of Hilltop, on the night of the census with John and Isabel Macarith, and then Eleanor Choice, who I mentioned earlier, was staying there as well as a visitor. So John was Hilltop's shepherd. He was 66 years old in the census, but the oldest employee was actually John Taylor, and he is found in the census nearby with his wife Sarah. Beatrix includes him in a 1922 letter to Eleanor Choice describing some of the day to day activities of the farm. So, that's one of the primary resources we have that talks about John and his responsibilities, and how their relationship as employer and employee kind of carried through. Another John, John Brockbank, was a laborer for the Heelis farm, and he lived in a house full of women himself. He had his wife, Sarah, his sister in law, Margaret, and a niece, Alice. Both John and Sarah's families had been in the area for at least 3 generations, right? Speaking to the very long traditions of the Lake District and the farming community there, and the sheep community there, right? I mean, that was such a significant part of the industry and the community of that part of England. So definitely John and his wife Sarah have these long lineages in the area, and very representative of the community. Also on the farm was the 20-year-old Ethel Green. She is the youngest of the employees. She's living with her parents, a younger sister, and a niece. She was just a general farm worker for Mrs. Heelis at Hilltop. It doesn't look like she stayed there very long. She kind of just was taking a job, right? Almost like our teenagers today take a summer job. It seems like it was kind of one of those situations. The Lancaster family was also in the area. Henry, the father, was the cowman on the farm, and he had just actually added to his family. He has a son, Arthur, who's only 2 months old at the time of the census. So that was fun to see, because it's definitely, you think about this 2-month-old, and his dad works for Beatrix Potter, and he would have grown up in that community, and he certainly would have read the books, but also would have been exposed to stories by his family, right? His parents knew her and knew her well. And so you have kind of this very interesting situation of thinking about an infant growing up and reading the books, just like all, basically every British child did. Um, but also, knowing that dad works on the farm. Yeah. And then lastly, Tom's story. He it kind of famously became Beatrix's tenant farmer. Later in 1921, he's actually a farm laborer on a nearby property for in Troutbeck. He's working for a man named Mr. Bragg in High Green. He actually becomes rather notorious in the Beatrix Potter story because he is the person who actually spreads her ashes after she dies. And he does so by her request, by himself on a secret part of the property. And he never told anybody where he did that, just like she wanted. And so the only person who knew where Beatrix Potter's ashes were spread was Tom Story. And he died having never revealed that information. So there he is in 1921, just about to enter her life and her world, and then of course becomes a very trusted colleague and relation with Beatrix Potter, right? So Beatrix Potter, as I started with at the beginning, kind of leaves this very long-lasting legacy, and that certainly is true for her books. And her personality, but also, of course, the land, right? Certainly can't forget the land. Um, the 1921 census helps us really understand what that land was and the people of that land before she buys it and before it's gifted to the National Trust. So, um, just to put that into context, right? So the 1921 census happens. In 1929, Beatrix Potter purchases most of the Monk Coniston estate, and that is a big chunk of the piece of property that then gets donated to the National Trust. So the 1921 census is the last time that we see most of that land on kind of private property, right? Before it goes into Beatrix Potter's world and then gets moved into the National Trust. The 1921 census really helps us tell the story of the people who were working this land and the community there just a few years before she buys it. So living on the property, a number of people, because the Mont Coniston estate actually took up a huge amount of acreage. One of the individuals was Thomas Ginbison. He was 91 years old at the time of the census. He's a retired estate laborer. And I still find it interesting that in 1921, he's unable to sign his own name on the census. He leaves his mark instead, and then the census is signed by a witness. That you can kind of see that on the screen there as I've pulled that portion of the census form out. Ray Castle was another part of the property. Now she never owned the castle itself, but she did own a lot of the land around the castle, and the two have really become kind of synonymous, right? You can't really talk about the Beatrix Potter story without including Ray Castle. In 1921, there is a single occupant, Gregory Owen. He's a 75-year-old director of a cotton manufacturing company from Manchester. Clearly, there kind of on holiday and leasing the house or the castle itself. It's not a house, it's a castle. Leasing the castle as kind of a probably getting away from the hustle and bustle of his business life, and kind of taking a break, right? Taking a break from real world. The Mont Coniston estate actually includes, of course, a number of people. And the quote from the National Trust website that I found to be quite relevant here, in 1934, Beatrix writes a letter to a woman named Eleanor Rawnsley, and she says, "I wish there may be a sufficient representative number of the old farms in the hands of the trust." And to me, that quote is just screaming that Beatrix Potter wanted not just the land to be preserved, but the traditions and the people and the stories. Um, in my mind's eye, I kind of see her as almost a historian, right? She's certainly trying to preserve a piece of British culture that she sees declining and kind of disappearing during her lifetime. So honoring that quote, honoring that request, that wish of hers, we have a number of individuals who were working the land in 1921. Robert Hamill, who was 42 as a gardener. Francis Eddington was 65 years old. He was the head forester. He was widowed in 1921, living with his daughter Helena. John McCune, a fish culturist from Scotland. William Collingwood, 66, an artist and author. He actually designed the Ulverston War Memorial, which was installed during Beatrix Potter's lifetime. And Sergeant Edward Major, who was a veteran of the war and domestic gardener, and he was actually working on the Mont Coniston estate before and after the war, immediately after. And that little snippet of newspaper article you see kind of prominently on the screen talks about some of his experiences in France, his experiences in the trenches. 15 yards from the enemy, and then his return to the Lake District. It's really an incredible opportunity to blend some of these stories together, to be able to look at the objective here was to say what was Beatrix Potter doing in 1921 and what was her story, what was happening in her community. But when you get into some of these details, you start to realize that the story is so much bigger than just one woman. She might be at the core of everything, and she is the reason that we are able to preserve that land and remember some of these people and some of their activities. But I don't know, doing the research just really opens up the opportunity for a lot more than just one woman, right? So I hope that you guys have enjoyed some of the delving into this research and looking at some of these stories. It's been a great pleasure and a little bit of I don't know. I don't want to say it's an honor. I guess maybe it is. I feel quite. Maybe the right word is just to say I feel quite chuffed to be able to have done this research. Is a very British way of saying it. I don't like that screen. There we go. That's better. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this little journey into the Lake District with me. We're going to remind you that it's not too late for the perfect gift. The holidays are upon us. 25% off gift subscriptions. Go to findmypast.com or .co.uk for details. We really hope that you've enjoyed this little journey into the Lake District with me and on this Wednesday. And if you have questions or stories for us, please do feel free to reach out. Find My Past would love to hear from you. Let me see. Before I finish here, what's in the comments? Oh, Anya has a war story. This should be good. A cousin of mine was a female doctor at that time in France. I just received a book about women in medicine from Canada, and there's half a chapter dedicated to her. Wow, that's incredible. Very tough for anyone working with the wounded in World War One. Yeah, I agree. That research took me quite a while because I got emotional. It was very hard to do. Um, a couple of questions about the Potter family specifically. Thank you, Kim, for responding to some of those. Um, yeah, it's good. All right, so cool. Lots of thank yous. Very nice. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Um, and and Victoria saying it very well for me. Thank you. Beatrix Potter gave back to her community, an important thing to do. I 100% agree with that. Community is very important to me. It's very important to a lot of us at Find My Past. As you guys all know, you're a big part of that, and you're a big part of our experience in family history. So we'll just leave it with Victoria's comment today. I think it's been a pleasure to be with you this today. It's morning for me, so I'll say this morning. If you have questions or stories, please do share them with us, and we will see you on Friday for Find My Past from home on Friday and our new records. Thanks all very much. Have a great week.